Welcome to You and the Law. I'm Steve Cilente.
And I'm Bob Lally.
Today, Bob, we're going to talk about dog bites.
Dog ownership and dog responsibility, or liability, I should say.
This is kind of a special area of the law, isn't it?
Yes, this is the type of case that your what we call personal injury type attorneys handle on a contingency basis, or what we call injury cases.
What is a contingency?
A contingency fee is where you go to an attorney and you don't have to pay a retainer or an hourly fee up front. This type of case, where it's an injury case, is a little bit like an automobile accident case, is where the lawyer is willing to front the money for the case on a contingency. The lawyer is going to take a little bigger fee than you would if you were hourly. It's going to take probably about a third before you go to trial, maybe 40% if it gets filed. But the lawyer's putting his money at risk by prosecuting the case, and some of these cases are expensive.
Now, contingency fees can possibly be a way to go, assuming that that's what the lawyer offers, because if it's some case, that case goes away without settlement, the lawyer doesn't necessarily get paid at all, correct?
That's true. On a contingency basis, let's say the lawyer takes it on and he finds out there's really no insurance or no assets to collect on. He spent his time and effort and invested his money, and he's not going to get a fee or his expenses back, for that matter.
Are there special rules for dog bite cases compared to other type of cases, or do different parts of law apply?
Well, I wouldn't say special rules. We have some statutes that cover it in California, but the general rule is if your dog gets out and bites somebody or injures somebody, you're going to be responsible.
In other words, I'm not at home, my dog escapes, I don't know that the dog is out, somehow a board came loose and they get out, and I didn't know that the board was loose. I'm going to pay anyway?
Yes, you are. It is your responsibility to have control and to contain your dog. And a lot of people think you get one free dog bite in this state in California. It's not true.
Well, what about if the dog is known to you to have a propensity for being vicious?
Well, one of the things I'd like to say about if you're going to own a dog, make sure you have insurance coverage. Renters' policies cover this as well. But when you get these policies, make sure that, because a lot of the insurance companies now are excluding certain breeds of dogs. For example, pit bulls, American Staffordshire Terriers, I think they're called, Dobermans, Rottweilers. You could think you have insurance and not be covered by insurance. But I'm sorry, you need to get back to your original question there. I think I was getting off on a different tangent.
No, actually, you were right there where I thought it's important to know that usually there is insurance available. You may pay a pretty price for it, but some breeds, as you indicated, the insurance company does not want to insure it, and any liability that may come up may be your sole responsibility, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And more, I'm saying somebody comes to me with a dog bite case, and the first thing I want to know is what kind of dog is it? because that dog probably is not going to be covered at all. It's just getting more and more like this because of the publicity that certain breeds are getting in the different jurisdictions.
And certainly someone came to you and said, I've been sued because my dog bit somebody. You want to know, first of all, do they have insurance, what kind of dog they have? And everybody should read their insurance policy. If you're not sure, talk to your agent. Find out if your dog is covered or if you have one of those breeds that they say they're not going to insure. Now, you may be able to get a special insurance policy specifically for perhaps a pit bull or one of the other types of dogs, but most likely it's going to be a very high premium.
That's true. It's what we would call a rider on top of the other policy. But you're going to pay for it if they're willing to do it.
Now, using the analogy that I used before, my dog gets out through a boarding fence that I don't know is loose. They don't bite anybody, but there's a young child or a person walking by, and the dog, being friendly, knocks them over, trying to lick them, and the person gets injured. Is there liability there too?
Well, if you have a big dog and it gets out and it goes out and jumps on a child or an elderly person and knocks them over, it's certainly foreseeable. So the answer is you don't have to have a dog bite to be liable if you own a dog. You could have a situation where, it knocks somebody over, or a strange situation where it's the actual cause of a collision or something.
Now, in a previous show, we talked about small claims. Would this be an appropriate place, perhaps, to bring a small claims action?
No, and I got no. Well, most dog bite cases, the answer could be yes if it's a very small injury. But most of the time with dog bite cases, you have significant injury, even if it's a little injury, because it's particularly scarring on a young lady or a man that, they can't wear shorts anymore and it's important to them or something like that. Or in the dog bite cases, we're seeing more of a grabbing and a shaking and a tearing. But even a scarring, somebody may end up going to a plastic surgeon.
So some of the injuries can get rather expensive, correct?
Oh, correct, and affect people for their lifetime too.
I can imagine. I don't think I'd want to be on the receiving end. Now, and dogs, certainly if we know that they've got a propensity for being violent, they're special, they're treated differently because you're supposed to know about it and take additional steps. We hear oftentimes the term of punitive damages, especially in the case where a person knows that a dog has a propensity of violence. What are punitive damages, Bob?
Well, that's something over and above negligence, and you don't see it a lot in cases, but you have to have an outrageous, sort of an extreme type conduct where it's almost intentional. It's kind of an imputed intentional conduct because it's not meant for compensation. It's meant for punishing the person or making an example for others so that this conduct doesn't happen in the community again.
And in many cases that we see, the damages may be slight. When I say slight, we're talking about less than hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the punitive damages award can be many times what the actual recovery for the damages are. It could be millions of dollars in the right circumstances. But also, couldn't there be criminal liability if you own a dog and it's got a propensity of violence, or perhaps you tell them to go after your neighbor?
That is a very good point. Yeah, you can't have an agent commit a criminal act for you. You're going to be, if you know that dog is going to go out and injure somebody, and you do that intentionally or with gross conduct, you're going to get prosecuted. Now, a good example of this was that case in San Francisco where we had the Boston Mastiffs. Those dogs, and if you have one of these type of dogs, and you can say they're not, I've had a pit bull, and I've tried to tell people this is a nice, loving dog, but nobody would believe me. And you're not going to convince them otherwise, unfortunately. But they were prosecuted in San Francisco for having these type of dogs and having them in a situation where they would have access to people that were vulnerable.
Now, when people have dogs, but they don't own their own home, they're in a rental property, is that treated any differently than if you own your own home?
Well, somebody comes to a lawyer, I can tell you what's going to happen. The lawyer is going to look to where the money is. And if you have rental insurance, you may be covered as a renter, but you're certainly going to be a named party in the lawsuit if there is a lawsuit. You have the same duties as a tenant. Basically, it's like you own the house. But what's the more interesting question is the property owner's duties and obligations. Because if they know that there is a dog there or a breed that may have these propensities, and we're not picking on any breeds here, we're just kind of saying how the law is developed. But if that tenant knew or should have known, there's likelihood that they're going to be hooked into it, and their insurance is going to gone after too. And I can tell you that lawyers are really good at creative ways about going to this and following the trail back to the owners, because they want to know if that owner has assets, or first of all insurance, second of all assets because they have a rental property. But and all kinds of facts could make the difference. Have they been there checking it to see if there's a dog available? Has it ever been mentioned to them? Is it in the rental agreement?
Okay. Well, certainly lawyers have to look at whether or not they're going to be certainly successful, to whether or not the person that is going to be sued has any assets. There's nothing worse than winning a lawsuit, no matter how much it's for, only to find that the person has no assets, no insurance, which you end up handing your client as a piece of paper saying, you've won, but there's nothing to collect against. And there's always a hazard, Bob. Isn't it true that whether or not you win if you win a lawsuit and you have that piece of paper saying you win, what happens if the person that lost declares bankruptcy?
You're out of luck, unless you're a secured debtor or something like that. Yes, you're out of luck. For example, when Chrysler went out of business, a lot of lawsuits went out the window.
So bankruptcy could basically put an end to your judgment, because if it's discharged in bankruptcy, it's gone for all purposes, correct?
That's true. That's true. And I don't want to say also, still, even if you don't have insurance or assets, I mean, that's what the law is there for, is to make sure that people, take care of their animals properly and control them properly. And sort of a backup to that is you could be criminally liable. And you just, would need to take care of the dogs appropriately so nobody does get injured.
We're in Calaveras County. We see a lot of dogs. Certainly there are dogs that people live in the towns. But what about ranch owners who have dogs? Do they have any special protections under the law?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I learned that kind of one time when we had a ranch and we looked out and our dogs were over there chasing the neighbor's cattle. If they're putting the other neighbor's animals or livestock in jeopardy or at risk, that neighbor could take some serious action.
Now, as I recall, the owner of a ranch, if it's not their dog, obviously they know how to deal with their dog, but if somebody else's dog comes on their property and they're harassing their livestock, that owner can take some very serious action against your dog, correct?
Right. Yeah, I think the person would want to look to the immediate situation, whether the cattle are just being chased. I shouldn't say just being chased, because that's a very serious thing up here, because it endangers people's livelihood.
In fact, the owner of the livestock that's being harassed. Now, we're not talking about necessarily just biting or nipping at the heels, but actually harassing livestock. That rancher has a right to take the life of your animal.
That's correct. That's correct. I like to urge people to take the conservative approach and say, well, if that dog is chasing, my livestock and some, for that rancher to go and talk to him or write a letter, but and then take the more immediate approach if there's an emergency where the dog is actually chewing on a livestock. However, that doesn't always happen.
Right.
That doesn't happen.
I want to make it clear that the livestock owner, the rancher, does have a right. It's in the law. And ranchers, talk to a lawyer before you take that action, although I'm sure that most of you know what the law is in that area. But if you're the dog owner that whether or not the life of your animal has been taken, you could be responsible up to 3 times the value of the animal, or any animal, livestock animal, that was injured by your dog.
That's correct. So, I mean, the law looks at ranches and dogs because they want to protect the cattle. I mean, that's people's livelihood. Or an example could be not just, well, you take a heifer or something, and it's going to give birth, and a dog is chasing it, it's going to put it to the point of stress where another cow isn't going to be born, and somebody's going to lose a little bit on that.
And 10 to 1, the livestock was probably a prize animal, or at least that's what happens in court oftentimes. Now, when we're talking about livestock, this applies to chickens, ducks, geese that are being raised on the ranch property. They're all part of livestock, and they, again, your dog their life can be taken. And there is no liability against the rancher in most cases, or the livestock owner, for taking your animal's life. Now, certainly if your animal's just sitting in their front yard and they're not doing anything, just sitting there, they're not harassing any livestock, and certainly the rancher should not take their life, but I'm sure it happens.
Right. If I was that rancher, I'd want to make sure I saw what the dog was doing, what the animal was doing to the livestock, rather than somebody telling me.
Right. And of course, there is animal control in Calaveras County, then you should, if you're an owner, I don't care if it's a barking dog, call animal control, or if you've got a dog in the neighborhood that's escaping, harassing people, or just wandering around, doesn't have a license, call animal control, talk to them. They may be able to take some action. They may be able to contact the owner of the dog, advise them of what the law is, or if it's somebody walking down the street that's got an unleashed dog.
That's true. Take precautions as they occur. And you made one really good point there, Phil. Mentioned if you do have a dog in Calaveras County, you need to have the dog licensed.
Absolutely. And rabies shots.
Correct. That is so important because you're exposing that dog doesn't have rabies shots, you got a problem.
And I can tell everyone out there that going through, if you had a child that had to go through a rabies shot series, that's not something you want to do. And if you're the owner of the dog, you may find that medical bill gets very expensive, even if it was a slight nip. If that other person, especially if it's a child, has to go through that series, it's very traumatic. Why? Do I know? I had to go through it. And it actually had nothing to do with the dog. I had a sick lamb, and I was caring for it. I touched its saliva, didn't know what was wrong with it, only to find out that what was wrong with it was it had rabies. So I had to go through the series.
It's quite significant, quite significant.
Yes, it was, in my life it was quite significant.
Right. That's where we're talking about is when if you're involving a case with a dog injury of some type, it's usually going to be significant, and that's why you want to make sure you have insurance coverage for that. There's one, I'm just going to switch the pace a little bit here, that it's about dog owners. I heard about a case, I heard of this happening twice, where the dog owner took the dog to the pet store, the grooming store, to get it groomed. And lo and behold, the pet store, it gets out. And the dog escapes and gets hit by a car. What do you think of that situation?
Well, I think it'd be the responsibility of the pet store owner, but I don't do dog cases, so yeah. I don't know.
Well, there's actually, I heard of a couple of those, and another attorney had asked me about the case and the procedure in it, and yeah, this is quite a valid case, and you know, people get very attached to their animals and pets, and there's, you know, that could affect somebody if that dog's been a family pet for years.
Now, one of the questions that has come up in my practice, you're talking about dogs in stores. We see more and more today, and they're classified as service dogs. Anybody not anybody, but people with certain disabilities qualify to have a service dog. They don't have to have a special tag on them. They don't have to wear a vest that says that they're a service dog, but they can literally go anywhere with that dog, whether it's a restaurant, a train, an airplane, and they have a right to keep that dog with them, under a leash, of course. And under federal law, because it's federally mandated, not only can they go anywhere, all of the a store owner can do is ask, is that a service dog? And if the reply is yes, that's the end of the discussion. Did you know that you can't even ask why they have a service dog? In other words, what infirmity causes them to have a service dog? Who's the doctor that wrote the note saying you should have a service dog? All you can ask, is that a service dog? And if the answer is yes, that's end of story. You've got to allow them in your business.
So if they have the sign on them that says service dog, that's going to do it?
They don't even have to have a sign. No badges, nothing. It just you ask the owner, is that a service dog? And the answer is yes or no. If the answer is no, certainly you can ask them to leave. Now, nobody questions like seeing eye dogs. Because certainly you can identify that that's probably a seeing eye dog. Service dogs are a little harder because there may be no identifying marks or badges on the dog, but if it's a service dog, it's all through. But that doesn't change the liability if that dog bites somebody, correct?
That's correct. They screen those service dogs, as I understand it, quite carefully. But if you still have a duty to control your dog, and let's say you're a person with a disability and you have one of those dogs and it's exhibiting qualities that it shouldn't be, you probably want to bring that up with the agency that you're working with.
Now, interesting you said that they have to be qualified. Certainly with seeing eye dogs, they've got a lot more responsibility because the person that they're assisting can't see, doesn't know when a traffic light's there or traffic or some obstacle. The service dogs, interestingly enough, it's the owner that determines the qualifications of the service dog. There's no testing process, there are no certain qualifications. It could be a miniature poodle, it could be a Great Dane, it could be any breed, but if it's a service dog, it's the owner who decides whether or not the dog is qualified.
One of the things I want to talk about in the handling of dog cases is almost, I don't know what it is, but almost probably about 70 to 80% of the time, it involves children. And you got to think, if you have a dog, what's foreseeable? You know, is a child going to go over your fence where that dog is? Is the dog adequately contained? Because if you don't take precautions like this, or let's say you have it without a fence and it's running around the neighborhood, that could be a situation where you're exposing yourself more than just negligence.
Now, you said another term, a legal term, foreseeable. Now, we know what foreseeable means, but in the law, foreseeability is a very special definition or an explanation, as it were, on what is foreseeable. Bob?
Oh, for example, if you have a car accident and somebody hurts their neck when you bump into the back of them, was that foreseeable? Let's say you have another car accident and somebody bumps into the back of somebody and they tap, the thing, but the head goes back and forth and the person has a really thin skull. The question is that foreseeable? And you take your victim as you find them in that case, yes. But if it's an act that isn't foreseeable, an intervention by a third party, let's say, one person hits another person who hits, if it's an intervention by a third party that is not foreseeable, I know I'm using a term of art here, that you can't possibly foresee is going to happen, then that would be an intervening cause and kind of just discharge the liability.
But when you're talking about dogs, isn't it almost fair to assume if you have a dog, anything is foreseeable, from biting, scratching, jumping on somebody, harassing young people as they walk by? Isn't that pretty much what the law says when it comes to dogs?
Yes, if you have a dog and that dog gets out and injures somebody, the bottom line is you're going to be responsible for that. And most of the time, from a lawyer's perspective, it's a question of what are the damages going to be and how we're going to evaluate it and the processes. And, but yes, you're going to be responsible for that dog.
Now, I already said that I don't handle dog bite cases, and not all lawyers do. Even though we're in a small community and lawyers tend to do different things, some of us just don't handle certain cases such as dog bites, landlord tenants, and others. And it always brings up the question, if you've got an action, whether it's a dog bite or any other action, how do you find a good lawyer?
Well, the best way I can say is word of mouth. I think I mentioned that on an earlier show, is the word of mouth, particularly in a small community like this, or of course the phone book. You just want to make sure you're comfortable with that lawyer.
Is there, we've heard of the publication called Martindale-Hubbell. That is a publication, again, Martindale-Hubbell, that's available online. You can look up lawyers. You can go to State Bar website, take a look at who the different lawyers are. You can find lawyers relatively easy. Phone book works. But the question comes in, you can call them, and do you handle these types of cases? But is there any place other than Martindale-Hubbell that says this person or attorney is qualified to handle my kind of case? How do you determine that?
Well, Martindale-Hubbell I kind of like, because lawyers are rated by their peers. But the State Bar has specialties, and different sorts of litigation is regulated by that. Personal injury is not quite one, but their litigators can be specialists. You do have and the American Board of Trial Advocacy, if they're a member of that.
But there's really no place other than perhaps Martindale-Hubbell that says this person's qualified to handle these types of cases, correct?
There's none that I really know of where the lawyers are really rated by their peers like that. We don't have the Department of Consumer Affairs, we have the State Bar, but there's only, it only says that there's complaints. It doesn't tell you how good the lawyer is.
In fact, as far as I know, there's no place online or any resource you can go to determine what an attorney's win-loss rate is, correct?
Yeah, and people will say, how many cases have you won? Well, it's kind of like horseback riding. You probably aren't a good lawyer if you haven't had a few losses, because you haven't been around for a while.
And in some cases, it's a matter of, if a client comes to you, you know that they're in trouble, you know what the maximum consequences could be. Winning may be getting something less than the maximum consequences. It's not necessarily the case against them is dismissed, but you end up with the best possible deal for them. But there's no place I know of that will tell you their win-loss rates.
No, in fact, one of the things in a best settlement, you may mention this, the best settlement possible is usually where everybody goes away unhappy.
I've heard that, but that's probably more so in certain types of cases than others. On the word of mouth, I think is very important, where you contact other people who've dealt with this lawyer. Do they answer their phone? Do they respond to your questions? Are they easy to talk to? Word of mouth is probably one of the better forms of advertising, and certainly one of the better forms of resources to determine whether or not the lawyer you're considering should handle your case. Is that right?
Oh, I absolutely believe that. And you talk to your neighbors, and you usually just generally will hear about it. And one of the things is, when you go see a lawyer, is to have a conversation with them to see how comfortable you are.
Okay. Hiring a lawyer it's a very expensive, can be a very expensive process, and you certainly should take the time to check out the lawyer that you're considering handling. Especially if you've got a dog that's bitten somebody, you want to make sure you've checked your insurance, got the best defense possible. And again, thank you for joining us on You and the Law.